Hi, I'm Walt Wager, and I teach wood turning, and one of the concepts that people have trouble with is what direction should they be cutting in when they're cutting the wood, and what difference does the grain direction make. So I'm doing this short video on grain direction, and to try to understand the basic principle, I've glued together some bamboo skewers so that you can see the grain when I'm talking about some of these issues. Now when I'm turning, I'm going to turn a piece of pine where the grain is pretty obvious in that direction. Some wood, the grain isn't so obvious. So I'm going to turn something as a spindle with the grain going parallel to the wood, and then I'm going to turn something where the grain is going perpendicular to the wood. We call this spindle turning or faceplate. So first I'm going to talk about cutting on spindle direction, which means that the fibers of the wood are going to be running parallel to the lathe bed. Okay, adjust my tool rest. So I'm clearing the wood. And I'm going to use my spindle roughing gouge to make this round. Now, I've sharpened my tools before I start. There's no sense in talking about cutting wood with dull tools. Now, I want to get the spindle speed up because I'm going to be cutting across the fibers. And what I'm doing is I'm putting the spindle roughing gouge on the tool rest and letting the bevel contact the wood and then raising the handle so that I start cutting. So I'm going to be shearing off these fibers that are going in this direction. I can tell if I'm round just by resting the tool on top of the wood. I can tell I'm not round. I still have a little flat spot there, the vibration of the wood. So I have a couple more cuts to make. And if I tilt the tool and keep the bevel on the wood, I can get a pretty clean cut. Still a little bit there. And now a nice round piece of wood. This is my spindle gouge, nice and sharp, and I want to cut the fibers in the direction of support. In other words, these fibers up here are supported by those underneath them. And if I was using a knife to cut these, I'd want to cut in this direction because otherwise I'm coming into those fibers, directly into those fibers, and I'm going to lift them or split them. So I want to come in a direction, if I'm turning this corner off, that I'm coming with, that the fibers that I'm cutting are supported by the fibers underneath. That's the basic principle. Cut in a direction so that the fibers you're cutting are supported by the fibers underneath them. So if I'm cutting this, I'm cutting in this direction. I'm supporting the fibers underneath them. Now, will the tool cut in this direction? In this wood it will. It'll cut in this direction because the tool is sharp. But it'll lift the fibers as I cut, and I won't get a nice smooth cut. That cut is nowhere near as smooth as the cut I just made, and I'm tearing the fibers, as you can see right here, because I'm coming against that grain direction. To make a smooth cut, I put the bevel on the wood and I'm raise the handle to get the tool cutting in the direction I want, and then I'm cutting in the direction of the supported fibers. And that'll give me a nice smooth cut. Now what if I want to put a bead on here or a cove in the middle? So if I'm going to do a bead, I'll do a bead right here and a bead right here and a cove in the middle. So to make the bead, I'm going to rest the tool on the bevel on the wood and just swing it in the direction I want to go. Now notice I've got rough edges here because as I make that cut, I'm cutting against the fibers. So in order to clean that up, I have to come in this way and this way to the bottom of my bead. And to make a cove, I'm going to start out here and come down in the direction so that I'm cutting in the direction of the supported fibers. The fibers Now the fibers right in the middle of that cove are parallel, but you can see that as I cut, I have to switch and come down from the top to the bottom to the supported fibers. That gives me a nice smooth cut down to the bottom of that cove. The transition between a cove and a bead is usually a little flat surface called a fillet. And we can make that fillet just by coming over in this direction. Like that. Again, if I want to put a cove in here, I want to come down from and cut toward the supported fibers. So that's really all I have to say about spindle turning, is basically cut from the top down to the supported fibers. Now let's look at faceplate turning. This is often the orientation of the wood for a bowl. Now if we want to make this round, the problem is that if we use something like a spindle roughing gouge, there's a whole lot of area here that's going to catch that grain, catch that wood against the grain, and it's going to chip it off and break it, or even break the tool. So you don't use a spindle roughing gouge to make something round if the grain is cross grain, that is perpendicular to the lathe bed. Instead, what I want to use is my bowl gouge, and I want to come across the grain from this side to this side so that the grain is supported underneath. And so to make this round, make sure it clears the tool rest. And I'm going to come from the outside through that wood like that. And you see there'll be a little bit of chip out on this side because I'm coming off that edge and there's no support for that wood underneath. There's also chip out here, and the reason is if you look at the model, that at some point that wood is coming around, so the it's catching the edges of this top edge, and it's going to rip out those grains. Even if I'm coming in this direction, I'm going to rip out those grains. It would be worse if I were coming straight on. On this direction, the wood is supported by the grains underneath it. But as soon as it gets here, it's lifting those grains. So it's very common to see on a piece of wood like this, a smooth section where the grain is supported and a rough section where the grain is not supported and it gets ripped out. So I say it's more serious if I come in and like this, because there's no support against that side at all. Now if I speed it up and I come across, the edge like that, I can get a fairly decent cut. I'm not round yet. I still have a square spot right there. Just didn't give myself the best support I can for the cut. I'm going to cut. I want the bevel aimed in the direction I want to go. Across the wood like that. I can save a little tear out in the end by chamfering this edge. Now when thinking about a bowl, we generally round the bottom from this direction out from the inside out. And the reason is, if you think about it, that these fibers are supported by the fibers underneath them. If I were to come in this direction from the top to the bottom, I'd be cutting against that grain, and I'm going to get more tear out. It will cut, but you'll get more tear out. So in order to make this cut, there's two kinds of cuts I can make. I'll lower this a little bit. Make a shearing cut from the inside out like this, cutting with the grain. Or I can make a cut coming this way, if I could get at it, to come out with the grain. And that cut won't work for me now because I can't get the tool, the edge of the tool back on the wood well enough to make that cut. Everything's in the way. So the cut I'm going to make is a shearing cut coming out in this direction. Shape the bottom of my bowl. Now, in order to hollow this, I'm going to have to put a tenon on it, and I'll use my spindle gouge, put that tenon on, and basically I'm just going to come in like this, I get in there nice and flat against those jaws, and it's turning nice and square the way it should. Now, what about the direction of the cut here? Let's consider our bundle of sticks. If I cut this way, I'm cutting down into the grain. I'm cutting into supported wood. If I cut this way, I'm going to be coming against that grain when I cut. So I want to cut down this way, but I have no place to go. So I need some relief room in order to get my cut. And if I'm cutting this way, I'm cutting the supported fibers. If I'm cutting this way, I'm cutting against those fibers, and if I get that wing into the end grain here, I'm very likely to get a catch because it's an unsupported edge. I can support the edge with the bevel, cutting in this direction. I'm cutting with the supported fibers, and I'll get a pretty clean cut. If I cut in this direction against the supported fibers, I'm scraping. I can't put the like this, or I'll get a tremendous catch. So I'm scraping the wood against the grain, and I'm going to get tear out on the end grain side. In that direction, coming out this way against that edge, then I'm going to get, if I support that cut, the fibers underneath. Now a much cleaner cut. No tear out on that end grain because the fibers were supported. The principle is that when you cut toward the supported grain. And if it helps to make a piece like this so that you can see, how the grain is being supported as you make that cut, then do that. If I wanted to clean up the back of this and get the best cut possible, and I can't make that cut with this tool because I can't keep the bevel on the wood. The angle is too steep. But I can get another bowl gouge, just a little tiny 1/4 inch bowl gouge, that I ground the angle so that I can get it flat on the wood at this angle and then come around. That gives me a pretty nice cut, even on the end grain fibers that were coming around from the other direction. And to finish the bottom of the bowl, I could take my spindle gouge and just come in toward the center. Like that, and I use a little saw cut off that nib. And I can sand it. To summarize, when you're cutting in spindle direction with the grain running parallel to the bed, if you're cutting on the outside, you're cutting downhill, or you're cutting with the supporting grain underneath from the higher part to the lower part. If you're doing a cove, you're cutting from both directions, from the higher part to the lower part, and supporting the cut with the grain underneath. If you're cutting in this direction with the wood perpendicular to the lathe bed, you have to remember that the grain, you have to remember that when it's coming around like this, you're going to be cutting on this supported grain, then unsupported grain, supported grain, then unsupported grain, because of the direction of the wood. So it's better to cut across the grain rather than directly into it. If you're cutting from to the outside, your grain is supported by the grain underneath it here by coming in this direction. If you're coming to the inside, your grain underneath is supported, your cut is supported by the grain coming from the outside in. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that, and I hope this was helpful. If you like this video, please subscribe to my website, waltwager.com. Subscribe to my video channel in YouTube. You'll find more videos on my website. Thank you for watching.